Life Audio.
Christian Parent Crazy World with Catherine Segars is brought to you by Life Audio and is part of our Faith Toolkit series. For more inspirational faith-affirming podcasts, visit lifeaudio.com.
Welcome to Christian Parent Crazy World, the podcast that tackles tough topics to help you be a godly parent in an ungodly world. I am your host, Catherine Segars, and in today's episode, we will tackle this very provocative question: what assumptions control the way that you think? You know, according to my special guest today, David Richardson, we are all assuming something about the nature of reality, and every person in the entire world operates from one of three basic assumption types. Now, Dave has developed a much easier way to get to those root assumptions than earning an advanced degree in Christian apologetics. Yay, that's a relief, isn't it? Dave is going to walk us through those three basic assumption types, and along the way, he will help to answer some really big conundrums in our culture, like how extreme progressives end up siding with radical Islamists on college campuses. Have you been wondering why that is? I sure have. Because if you look at what Islam teaches, it is the opposite of what progressivism preaches. They are diametrically opposed. Dave has an explanation that makes a lot of sense. Spoiler alert, it has something to do with their underlying assumptions. That is the ground we will cover in this episode of Christian Parent Crazy World. So let's get started. Okay, so I want to jump right in today because we have a lot of ground to cover. If you were here for the last two episodes, you know Dave very well by now. Cliff Notes version, Dave has an MA in Theological Studies from the International School of Theology, a Master's of Theology from the University of Oxford. He worked with Campus Crusade for Christ as a missionary to college and university professors for 32 years. He is the CEO of the Assumptions Institute and author of the book Transparent: How to See Through the Powerful Assumptions That Control You. And that book is the topic we are covering today. So let's jump right in. Welcome back. We've got you back for one final episode, Dave, because this information has been so fascinating. I appreciate you sticking around to share more of your wisdom with us.
Oh, Catherine, thanks so much for the opportunity.
Let me just say, it is a rare guest that gets this many episodes, just saying. So we have been dancing all around the topic of assumptions for like 2 episodes now. And frankly, those appetizers were incredible. We were talking about the lost landscape of higher learning and the inherent flaws in the concept of worldview. Be sure to check out those episodes, moms and dads, if you haven't already. They're incredible. But now we are finally at the entree. Woohoo! Your book, Dave, is all about the assumptions that control every one of us. So please remind us again, what exactly is an assumption?
So an assumption is something that we all do. People will warn you, be careful about making assumptions. You can't help it.
Yeah. Oscar Wilde, right?
you can't help it. You will do it. It's unavoidable. So it's better to be informed about them and be careful about them rather than trying to avoid something that is unavoidable. And when you reach the edge of what you know and what you don't know, you have to assume something about reality that you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It just is. And so the basic assumption about reality is the thing you don't question, you cannot prove, and it's the thing that you assume. And how do you make an assumption? You don't know it, you trust it. So that is your basic faith commitment. The thing you don't question, you cannot prove, and you accept on faith. Every human does it.
All people of faith, yeah.
It doesn't matter whether you're a Christian, doesn't matter whether you're a Buddhist, doesn't matter if you're a secularist, an atheist, progressive, an earth worshiper, who cares? Every human does it. They just do it differently. They start with something that they do not question, cannot prove, and accept on faith. They just start with one of 3 different core assumptions about the nature of reality. And so that's what I focus on is, I spend a lot of time researching the nature of these assumptions that we all make and figuring out a way to categorize them and detect them. And I did it. And that's what's in my book, Transparent: How to See Through the Powerful Assumptions That Control You.
I am loving going through this. So let's jump right into these. What are these three primary assumption types? Break those down for us.
Yeah. Well, the first one is what I call a type 1 assumer. And each of these types, there are many different flavors of them, but they all start with this one core assumption about the nature of reality. And then they express themselves in a variety of different ways. So, for instance, the first one, the type 1 assumer, is the only thing that's real, the only thing that's important is physical stuff, matter and energy. So the nature of reality in its completeness is that it's physical.
That is the materialist you just defined.
So, yes, physicalists, materialists, naturalists, those are all different flavors of that basic core assumption that the only thing real and important is physical stuff. Things like minds. If I have a mind, it's the product of biochemistry. The gods, angels, demons, spiritual kinds of things, none of that's real for this kind of person. But they don't know it. They assume it. And so when you start with that core assumption, then your understanding of the world unpacks itself in fundamentally different ways than other assumers. Then there's the second one that's exactly the opposite, that everything in reality is non-physical in its nature. While there are physical things, those physical things are really expressions of non-physical things. Tribal animism would be an example of it. Polytheism would be an example of it. The god of the sea. Well, the sea is just a physical thing, but it's attributing some kind of a non-material personal character to a physical thing. So in a spiritual sense, this world we see around us, it's really all Maya, is what the Hindu would say. It's an illusion. It's really part of the universal spirit, Brahman, or whatever name that the particular believer gives it. But it's really spiritual in nature. It just seems like it's physical to us. So the thing that's really important is the spiritual side behind it, not the physical thing that we think we see. It's really the thing that's projected on our mind for our testing, to see whether we will disconnect from that illusion and realize the truth by enlightenment, and that we lose ourselves and become one with the divine. That's the driving force behind some world religions. So ultimate reality is either spiritual in nature or it's mental in nature, because those are the two broad categories of non-physical things, minds and spirits.
But add into that one thing that you talk about in your book, because this is where I was confused at first. First of all, Gnosticism would be contained in the second category. Okay?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, which certainly has a modern movement today. But what surprised me, and I was thinking about this, because I think what we're dealing with mostly in our culture today is this progressivism that we're seeing, a neo-cultural Marxism that we're seeing in our culture today. And so I'm thinking, well, that's atheistic, because Marx was atheistic. So that would be type 1, but that isn't. That is contained. No. Explain how that is contained in this second spiritual type, because this was fascinating to me. And I really dug into this in the book. I thought it was fascinating.
Yep. That's where I'm going right now.
Yeah. Oh, good.
So rather than things being spiritual in nature, they're really a mental creation.
Right.
So what both of these subtypes of type 2 are idealists. They believe in ideals, that ideals are real and they're achievable. So on the one side, the ideal is a spiritual ideal. Mm-hmm. And that while I may be flawed in some fashion, I can become perfected spiritually. And so I'm in this pursuit of becoming perfect spiritually, through whether it's a bunch of reincarnation and past lives, and eventually I've reached that state of nirvana and become one with the divine. But regardless of how it expresses itself, it's ultimately this pursuit of spiritual perfection. Mm-hmm. Well, this other flavor is they're not that spiritual; they're more sociopolitical.
Yes.
And so what they're seeking there is a sociopolitical perfection, human perfection. They're humanists.
Yes.
So what you have there is the pursuit of the perfect human and a society filled with perfect humans. While we see the flaws and faults in humanity, we see how to fix it. And so with our enlightened guidance, because we see how to get it done and our collective effort, if we can all work together, we can build a better world. And so that's that siren call to
coming from the right.
build this utopia.
Right.
That we can build a perfect society filled with perfect people.
Collective salvation, as one of our recent former presidents talked about, that we have the power within us to become that utopian society. I was curious. I wanted to ask you, is this kind of a reforming of Platonic theory where there's this alternate universe where there's a perfect world, but the idea that we can actually somehow attain it is crazy.
Yes.
And what's interesting is I think we're born with that God-given idealistic desire. C.S. Lewis would have called that our desire to live in another place, because we weren't intended to live in this broken state. We weren't intended to be fallen far from God's glory. We weren't intended to be here, but we find ourselves here. And inherently, I think we know, that's one of the great arguments for the existence of God. Inherently, I think we know it wasn't supposed to be this way.
Yes.
And yet it is this way. But the problem is we're doing Genesis 11. We're doing the Tower of Babel. We're thinking, I can save myself.
Yes.
We have this big flood just a few years back, right, where everybody was demolished. All of society was wrapped up in this flood and died. And so we're the regeneration. And now that's never going to happen again. You know why? Because I am going to build my own salvation. I'm going to build a tower that reaches to the sky. No flood could ever come again that could ever cause us. And I was reading this, I noticed something in it the other day. I don't know if I'd noticed before. It just stood out to me. The writer, which I guess we think was Moses, but he was putting in there that they were creating this tower with man-made bricks.
Yep.
Not with stone. And it says not stone. God made stone. Made with, it said with bricks, but of course bricks are man-made.
Yeah.
So this progressive, idealistic, mental utopia that we think that we can get to, that Marx said that we could get to, which of course has led to more destruction, not millions, hundreds of millions of people.
Yes.
Hundreds of millions of people who have died trying to get to that utopia.
More evil, suffering, and death.
Yeah, from that. But this utopia, this Tower of Babel that we're constantly going back to Genesis 11. That's what this progressive utopian state is.
Yes.
We can get there. And here with these man-made bricks that we're going to make, we're going to build brick by brick this society. And if you don't get on board with this, then you get canceled, you get marginalized, you lose your job because you're not one of the enlightened. You're not working towards us. So our belief system is actually hindering. We're the problem. It's I heard you say in one of your previous interviews, because we just went through this with COVID, right? It was a pandemic of the what? Not of an actual disease that came out of however it came out of. We don't need to get into all of that, although I think the evidence was clear. But anyways, it was a pandemic of the unvaxxed. So the people who wouldn't get on board with the man-made brick of salvation that we created in the vaccine, which we're discovering all of the things that were wrong with the vaccine and all of the health problems that are coming out of that about that. But if you don't get on board with this and build with these man-made bricks, then you're the problem. And then we need to get rid of you. People lost their jobs. People lost their health that were forced into it. I have a friend. I mean, the stories just go on and on. But anyways, that's the society, the utopia we have to build. And I heard you say it in a previous episode. It was so fascinating that if the ideal is possible, right, that we're obligated to fulfill that, to work towards that ideal, right?
Yeah. Well, if ideals are real, and they can be achieved, then they must be achieved.
They must be achieved.
I mean, you can't have an achievable ideal out there and not pursue it. That is the most attractive thing about idealism. I use a quote in some of my presentations from Carl Jung, where he says that all addictions are bad, whether they be alcohol, opioids, or idealism.
I love that. That's awesome. That should go on a bumper sticker.
Yeah. And because it is addicting.
It is an addiction.
Because, think about it for a minute. A person who describes themselves as a progressive,
Right.
Okay. Immediately gives away the ideal behind what they're doing. Because if you are a progressive, it implies progress.
Mm-hmm.
Well, progress towards what? Because, we don't want to go back to that. We want to move forward. Well, how do you know you're moving forward unless you have a goal in mind? What's that goal? They never tell you. It's never stated, always assumed. And that goal is the ideal human.
Right.
The ideal society filled with ideal humans. That's what they're working towards. And so when a person describes themselves as a progressive, it implies progress towards a goal. And what is that goal? It is the ideal, believing that those ideals are achievable. Well, if they're achievable, then how do you achieve the ideal? You have to conform to the ideal. That's how you achieve it, is everybody conforms to that ideal world, that ideal human, and we become our better selves. You hear that term used a lot these days. That's idealistic thinking. So what happens there is that first, in order for us to understand the ideal so that we can then conform to it, we try to persuade people to conform. And we have two indispensable institutions in our society that achieve that. One is education. The other, that's why education is no longer education, it's indoctrination.
Right.
And the other is the media. Education and the media are the institutions that are used to help shape, mold, and conform us to that human ideal. And it's interesting that there are a ton of progressives that are in those institutions. That's why. But if persuasion fails, you won't voluntarily conform to the ideal. What's next? Well, then you have to be made to conform. So where persuasion fails, then comes coercion. And there are two indispensable institutions in our society that do that: government and the courts, to make you conform to the ideal. That's that human ideal that we're trying to achieve, and that society filled with ideal humans that we're trying to build. And so we try to make people conform to the ideal. Well, if you can't be persuaded and you cannot be made, what's left? Right. You have to be marginalized and eliminated.
Exactly.
We do that virtually in our society. That's called cancel culture. Mm-hmm. But if you could get away with it, you would do it physically. You do it in reality. That's genocide. And every idealistic movement in human history ultimately results in genocide for that very reason. Yes. And the people that cannot be persuaded, will not go along, those are the people holding up everybody else. You saw the attitude during the pandemic. Well, just go get the blankety blank shot so we can get back to normal.
Right.
So we can get back to, so we can achieve that better world.
The idea. Okay. In one of your episodes, this blew my mind. You called that cancel culture and political correctness, it's secular Sharia. Explain that connection, because the caliphate is the idealistic world that the Islamic faith is going towards. So they're actually in this category. You put them in this category because they're idealists.
Yes. In fact, I wrote a whole appendix in my book specifically on why Islam is type 2. Yeah. Okay.
Explain that, because that blew my mind. Because we do see this now. It's interesting. I think we see it more one direction than the other, but we do see progressives always kind of linking up with Islamists.
Yeah, you're seeing it at Columbia University today.
Oh yeah, we're seeing it completely
with all the protests.
Now, it's crazy. It's and you're like, how?
Why are all the radical secularists hooked up with the radical religionists?
So here's what we hear is politics makes strange bedfellows, but really what we would say is assumptions. Our primary assumptions make strange bedfellows, because when the progressives end up in the same camp as the Islamists, you're like, how did that happen? You have an explanation for that I thought was fascinating.
Yeah. It's when you think about things from the Islamic perspective, the ideal, the spiritual ideal, is the caliphate, right? And everybody living together in a world caliphate. That's paradise. That's the ideal. That's the goal. And you don't even have to be a true believer. All you have to do is submit, and you'll pay the tax or whatever. But everybody can be a part of it, whether you're a true believer or not. And the way that you achieve conformity to that ideal is with Sharia law. That's the purpose of Sharia, is to conform you to the spiritual ideal and to keep you conformed to the spiritual ideal. I mean, what happens if you decide you want to convert from Islam to something else? The Sharia will keep you conformed.
Yes.
Because
no option there.
At the very worst, you'll lose your family and friends. At worst, you'll lose your life. So that's the purpose of Sharia. But not all Sharia is religious. That, in fact, there is such a thing as secular Sharia that does the same thing, that it conforms you to the sociopolitical ideal, and it keeps you conformed to the sociopolitical ideal. Yep. And that secular Sharia is what we call political correctness. That's its purpose, is to conform you to the human ideal and to keep you conformed to that human ideal. Because if you don't, what happens to you? You get shamed, you get chagrined, you get ostracized, marginalized, and eliminated, either virtually or actually, because that's what idealists do. And it doesn't matter what form they are. In the Soviet Union, I traveled to the Soviet Union twice when it was the Soviet Union. When I was in college, I spent a whole summer there. And then later, the year before it all fell apart, I spent some time in the winter in Siberia, of all places, looking for opportunities to build spiritual movements, because we could see that the country is starting to open up and we didn't know for how long. And so I wanted to take advantage of the opportunities. But in the Soviet Union, the ideal was described as the new Soviet man. The worker, the great worker living in the worker's paradise was described as the new Soviet man. And we're building the new Soviet man. And all of society was oriented around that. In Hitler's Nazi Germany, it's the same thing. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer was the description of the ideal. The ideal people, the Aryan race. One people, one country, one ruler. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. So it's the ideal people, the Aryan race, living in the ideal country, Germany, led by the ideal ruler, Hitler. That was the basic dogma there, an expression of the ideal, because most people don't understand that fascism is not right-wing at all. Fascism is actually another form of socialism. It's left-wing. It's equally anti-capitalist as communism. They just disagree on who owns the means of production.
Right.
But it was created by socialists. Hitler was a socialist. Mussolini was a socialist. And they just tweaked it into National Socialism. The National Socialist German Workers' Party. That's a Nazi. It's been twisted by the left to give a thesis and an antithesis to fight. That's the cultural Marxism. But anyway, that's another conversation for another time.
That's interesting. That would be interesting to dig into. But keep going.
Yep. So regardless of the movement, I mean, you see the same thing in China or any other idealistic movement. It always ends up with a certain number of people that have to be eliminated because they won't go along. And the worst offenders usually are Christians because our allegiance is to another king. To another world. Right. And we know that humans can't be fixed. If humans could be fixed, why would we need a savior? Right. And yet we do. Either we need one or we don't. And if we do need one, then Jesus is the savior. And if we don't, then we can save ourselves. And so then, progressivism, idealism follows. So those are the first two assumptions about reality. It's all physical or it's all non-physical. Something that's it's a materialist set of assumptions, or it's an idealistic set of assumptions, or there's a third way. And that is there are not just one reality. All these created things, there's both physical and non-physical things. They're both equally real. But the thing that they have in common is that they're created. Yes. And if they're created, then they're created by a creator. And so that is actually the very first truth that's taught in the Bible in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created. So that, in fact, there's a creator and there is a creation. It's not just in the beginning God, but no, in the beginning God created. And that creation is not God, and God is not the creation. You can tell the two apart. They're not the same thing. God is not the universe, and the universe is not God.
So you have spirit and matter in the first, 5 words out of in the beginning?
Yeah.
God created. First 5 words in the Bible, you've got spirit creating matter. Yep. And so according, obviously, to the Christian assumption that we have, the third type that we have, you've got spirit and matter. First 5 words of the Bible establish that clearly. I love what you... Yeah, keep going there. That's fascinating.
And then in that created reality, there's both physical and non-physical things, and they're equally real. Angels and demons and all that are equally real, along with matter and energy, plants, microbes, stars, and planets. They're all equally real. But the thing that they all have in common is that they're all created.
Yes.
They're created physical, they're created non-physical, and humans have both a physical and non-physical nature about us because we're made in the image of God. But that is an entirely different assumption, and it is an assumption. It's not something that I can prove because I don't have access to God. The only thing that we know about God is what he's revealed to us, because he, existing apart from the creation, reaches into the creation and reveals himself to us.
Right.
Reveals himself through his word, the Bible, reveals himself in his son who became flesh and dwelt among us. So it's what God reveals to us about him. But can we verify it? Can we get to him? No, it's not something that I can prove. But based on that assumption versus the other assumptions, this one makes far more sense than the other ones do.
The thing I would add to that, we can't prove it, but we can experience it.
Oh, yes.
That is what, and that is proof for the individual. We can experience. And of course, there's the evidence and all of the things that we can look at, but that still is not definitive proof of his existence. But we can walk in a vibrant, living, thriving relationship with him and experience him.
Yes.
And that is what convinces us that our assumption is real, because we experience every day, right?
Yes. Yes. And the thing is, each of those core assumptions, it's all physical, it's all non-physical, or there is a creation and creation, that there's two realities. Those are mutually exclusive.
Right.
Meaning the moment you adopt one, you exclude the other two. If it's all just physical, then non-physical things are off the table. So 2 and 3 are off the table because they think non-physical things are real. If you start with the middle one, number 2, everything is just non-physical in reality, then number 1's gone because they believe physical things are real and important. And 3 is also gone because type 3 assumers likewise think that physical things are real and important. But if there are 2 realities, like the type 3 assumer operates from, there's a creator and a creation, then there can't be just one reality, either a physical one or a non-physical one.
Right.
So that's why they're mutually exclusive. The interesting thing is that means that only one of them can be true.
Right. One of them has to be true.
So then one of them has to be true. Which one is it?
Exactly.
Well, it's the one that matches reality, because that's the basic definition of truth. So that's the thing that's missing, is that, when Christian schools and Christian ministries and other things like that, we're in the search for truth. That's great. How do you know you found it?
Yeah.
Do you know what truth is in the first place? Can you recognize it?
When you see
it. When you see it. So I use a basic definition. True things match real things, and real things are true. That's what's called the correspondence theory of truth in philosophical circles. True things match real things, and real things are true. So, for instance, if I was to say, "Isn't that a beautiful orange sweater that you're wearing today?" and you say, "What? No, that's green." Well, of course it's green, because what I said about the actual real sweater that you're wearing didn't match. Therefore, what I said is false. That's how our brains work. If you go outside at night and you look in the north sky about 30 degrees above the horizon, there's this one little star up there called Polaris. That's the North Star. And that's the true North Star. Now, there's thousands of other stars all around it, and you can call any one of them you want the North Star. But only one truly is, in reality, the North Star. And in fact, if you navigate by any of those others, you'll get lost.
Yeah.
But if you navigate by Polaris with a ship, you'll be able to get around reliably, because there's only one true North Star. True things match real things, and real things are true. So that's an important thing to understand what truth is. It matches reality. Truth matches reality. So truth is really a measurement of correspondence or matching to what reality is. That's why these core assumptions are so important, because what we know about reality, we only know in part. We don't experience all of reality. We just experience our little piece of it. And we can't get out of it to see what it is completely. So we don't really know what reality is completely. That's why it's an assumption, at least in part.
So I have a question about type 2, when you're talking about they believe that only spirit is real, or only, but it's, certain religions
reality.
a mental reality. See, that's where when you're saying that, you're not like someone like a progressive. They do believe in matter. They believe that matter exists, but they don't believe that matter is important, that's not that matter helps you to get to the ideal, or it can keep you from getting to the ideal.
It's an instrument to achieve the ideal. Yes.
Yes. It's an instrument to impede it, because if you're greedy, if you're hoarding too much, if you've got too much wealth, too much power, whatever, that is an impeding someone getting to the ideal, unless, of course, you happen to be of the right persuasion idealistically, then all of those things are great. And we'll just keep adding to that, which is how I think BLM ended up with their mansions, right? So anyways, so it's not that they don't believe that matter is real, although there are some people of certain faiths that believe that matter is not even real, right? I mean, there are some that do. That are so convinced of that spiritual reality that they believe that matter is just an illusion. But your typical progressive, modern day progressive is not going to say that. They don't believe that. They believe in inanimate objects. They believe in matter, but they just don't believe that that idealistically matter is not what matters. What matters is the ideal that they can accomplish, that spiritual, quote unquote, spiritual ideal that we can all get to if we're all on board with it. Yeah.
Or the human ideal. The sociopolitical ideal. Exactly. That's more important than the physical. And the physical things become an instrument or a means to achieve that sociopolitical ideal. So science becomes an instrument to social engineering. It's not science for science sake. It's science for social engineering. Right. So that's how you got all the crazy stuff that we got during the COVID pandemic. That's how you get climate science and many other things.
Well, you've got education as a goal, is a medium to get that to that ideal, the court system, whatever it is, they will utilize whatever. And they have to break down things that impede that progress.
Mm-hmm. So then it's not that they would necessarily deny it, but they would say it's not important compared to the ideal. Yes. And many will say that the physical world is just temporary anyway. That our forever existence is going to be, a spiritual only existence. That's your Gnosticism. Islam is that way. Many other non-Christian religions are like that also. But Jesus was very clear that our forever existence is in a body, and a body is physical. That's what the resurrection is all about. That Jesus was the first fruits of the resurrection, and that we one day will exchange this corrupted body for an incorruptible one. That's 1 Corinthians 15. And so that physical and non-physical are equally important because they're all made by God. Yes. As opposed to the other sets of assumptions operate in a very different way. Well, which one of those assumptions is true? Because you can adopt any one. You can assume any one. Which one is the true one? It's the one that matches the world that we see, know, and experience. And that's the one that's true. And the others, while they have logical consistency, don't describe the actual real world we live in. Therefore, they're false. And this helps me get around the relativism of worldview, because I can say, this is true, this is not, this is why. And at first, when you start with those core assumptions, it doesn't seem obvious which one matches reality. But when you ask successive questions and unpack it, and follow where that core assumption takes you in describing reality, very quickly you begin to see it. That's what the critical assumptions test is all about, that I created. And then we automated it with a phone app, so you can take it with you wherever you go, and you can practice it as you're reading articles, as you're watching TV shows and movies, podcasts, et cetera, et cetera. How do I know what I'm being told is true? Well, look for the underlying assumptions, and it'll reveal what they believe reality is like, and then you'll know immediately whether it's true. So I have a total of 8 questions on the critical assumptions test. The first one is about the core assumption. What is really real? What is really real is the thing we don't question, cannot prove, and accept on faith. We assume it. And that core assumption about reality, then if you start with that one, then how do you answer successive questions? Well, the very next one is, if that's what's here, that's the nature of everything in the real world, how did it get here? Where did everything come from? That's the second question on my critical assumptions test. If it's all just physical, where did it come from? Well, it's just a physical only exists. So it's just the laws of physics that made the universe. That's where it came from. It's just somehow or another natural laws sparked off a universe. And there's various different ways that it's explained, but that's the ultimate answer to the question. Nature made nature. And then the second person would say, well, the physical world is not the thing that's important. It's the non-physical world. So it is an expression of that ideal that's where everything came from. It either came from spirit or it came from mind, that the world that we live in is an expression of that ideal. And then the type 3 person would say the creator created the world. So it's a creation of the creator. Those are 3 different ways of answering that same question, and you explain them in very different ways. Then when you get to the third question, what's really real? Where does everything come from? The third one is, how does it all work? Because the universe is in motion. It's not sitting still. It's not static. What makes it go? What's the basic driving force behind how the world works? Well, if it's a physical only existence, you would say, well, it's the natural laws that made it. So it's natural laws that run it, because what else is there? It's just physical only things. So it's natural laws that run it. Well, here's where we begin to see a disconnect with reality. And a disconnect with reality is a sure indicator of a false assumption. Because if it's the natural laws that made it and the natural laws that run it, which would come first? The laws of the universe. Because the laws would have to exist prior to the universe in order to make it, right? Right. But the problem with that, of course, is if there's no mass, there's no gravity. And if there's no energy, there's no conservation of energy. So which comes first? The laws of the universe. It's an impossible chicken or the egg conundrum that inspired Stephen Hawking to write A Brief History of Time, and many other philosophers and scientists have tried to answer that question over the centuries, and none have done it using these assumptions because it's not possible. It disconnects from reality. There has to be something else. And in fact, what's a law? It's it's nothing physical. You're appealing to something non-physical to explain the physical. But I thought that was out of bounds. Yeah. So you're kind of sneaking in the back door the very thing you say is not real or important.
Oh, yeah. So the type 1s believe in matter, but they believe in laws, which are not material. And so they're sneaking. They're believing in something that is not matter in order.
Yeah. The type 1 guy is sneaking in something from type 2 to try and fill in the hole.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. They get caught up in their own.
And the same thing happens there. So that's physical evolution. And then, that's your biochemical evolutionists are in that category. Then, with the type 2 assumers, what makes everything go? Well, it's an ongoing process towards perfection. Right. Well, we're moving towards either spiritual perfection or human perfection, sociopolitical perfection. That's what drives the universe. So it's sociopolitical or spiritual evolution. Mm-hmm. That's what drives everything is an evolutionary process towards perfection. But if there's a creator who created everything, what makes everything go? Well, what makes everything go are natural laws that are a reflection of God's unchanging character. God's the same yesterday, today, and forever, and his character is reflected in the things that he made. So that's why the universe behaves in a lawful, repeatable, predictable fashion, is because God never changes. He's imminently lawful, repeatable, and predictable. We know exactly who he is, and he doesn't change. There isn't that's why his character is a lawful character, and his universe behaves in a lawful way. And so when you look at those 3 explanations, which one describes the world that we live in? Well, obviously, we live in a lawful, repeatable, predictable universe. That's why science is possible. But which one of those other 2 sets of assumptions provides that foundation? Neither of the other 2 do. Because a random interaction of matter and energy that results in complex organization in complex organisms is not a lawful process. It's a chaotic process. Yes, it's completely unpredictable. Mm-hmm. So how do you get lawfulness, predictability, regularity that science demands out of those sets of assumptions? You can't. That's why they're not true. It doesn't describe the real world that we live in. And so when you find that it doesn't describe the real world, therefore we know that set of assumptions cannot be true. I'm not saying you can't believe it. You just can't say it's true because true things match real things, and real things are true. And so then the next question is, where is everything going? Everything's going towards annihilation and death. Once all the usable energy in the universe is used up, the universe will just stop moving. When my life's done, it's done.
Type 1, that's their answer.
Type 1. Yep, that's the type 1 answer. The type 2 answer is that we'll eventually reach spiritual or human perfection. And the third one, where's everything going? It's ultimately going towards life with or without God in a new creation. because God promises to fix and remake everything. And depending on how we decide about Jesus during this life, we'll live with or without God, because there's a resurrection to life and a resurrection to judgment. We find that in the Gospel of John, amongst other places.
Yeah.
So regardless of what your decision is, there is another life after this life. One will be a nice one and the other one not so nice, but those are the consequences of our choices. But those are three fundamentally different ways of answering the question based off of the core assumption. That's why that core assumption is so critically important, because it leads to reality or it doesn't. Then, the other four questions quickly. What is a human being? Before we can talk about human struggles and human activities and other things like that, we first assume what a human being is in the first place. That's our identity. That's our purpose, those kinds of things. Well, a human is either a highly evolved animal. That's a type 1 answer. Or an evolving expression of the social or spiritual ideal, or a human is a physical and non-physical creation made to reflect who God is. Those are three fundamentally different answers based on a core assumption, and which one describes reality.
Yep.
How do you get inherent value, worth, and dignity to a human that's nothing more than a highly evolved animal?
Right.
Because we're no different than rats.
And how in the world do people that are materialists really get to any kind of conclusion about value or equality? I mean, it's impossible really to get there from that materialistic perspective, because really all we have is survival of the fittest. It's just that's the best answer. Why in the world was Hitler wrong for exterminating 6 million Jews? Why would that be wrong from a materialistic perspective? It seems like it would have been a pretty wise choice if that would have benefited him and the Aryan nation and the German. And why were we wrong with slavery? Why not build our economy and the strengths of our nation off the backs of slave labor? If we can do that, because how do you get any inherent value
in a human?
In a human being that you can't? I don't see how in the world you could do that. This, to me, this is one of the easier ones, I think, to dismantle, but in that sense, because you can't get human value, and everybody wants to value humanity.
Yeah. And from the idealist perspective, whether they're sociopolitical or spiritual, you have value if you contribute.
Right.
Yeah. If you're a contributing member of society, you have value. But what does that mean for the very young, the very old, the infirm, the disabled, whatever? What does that mean? Well, you're not a contributing member of society. You're a useless eater.
You're not valuable.
You're not valuable. You might have been valuable at one time, but you no longer are.
Right.
How do you get inherent value, worth, and dignity in a human out of those assumptions? You can't. But if we are all a custom creation
praise God,
of God, then all of us are equally valuable just because we're here, not for anything that we have or anything that we can do. It's just who we are as humans created in the image of God. And so it doesn't matter.
Seriously, which is the most attractive assumption there, for heaven's sake? I mean, like, why would you want to? Because the other two lead to really, really dangerous places that have caused a lot of heartache and suffering and, like you said, genocide in the past, or either just what they did, in Nazi Germany, because these human beings, they didn't have value because of their ethnicity, their race. And so we can do horrific experiments on them and discard them. It just, because we're going after this idealistic society and they're standing in the way. Why not do that? Why not get rid of the, people that are standing in the way, or do horrible experiments on them? It's horrific to think about that, but that's exactly where we've been in society and will continue. This question, I think, is extremely valuable one to really camp in on, in terms of what is the nature of a human? What gives a human being intrinsic value? This was fascinating. I was listening to this woman give her testimony. She had been a materialist. Her name is, I want to say it was Jen Fulwiler. I had not heard of her before, but I stumbled across her. Yeah. Jennifer Fulwiler. And she changed her mind about atheism. She had gotten into those college campuses and universities, and she was a materialist. That's what she had been taught. She was running in circles. The professors were all materialists, and she was a materialist. And so she believed that, but her father wisely, even though he was an atheist, had taught her always to seek truth and question her assumptions. And so she began to do that. And she had a professor who had said that it would be more ethical to kill a newborn baby than it would be to kill an adult pig, because an adult pig is more cognitively complex.
Yes.
And that kind of rubbed her the wrong way, but she kind of went with it, because that's honestly where a materialistic kind of thinking, that's where you end up, is with that kind of moral code, that kind of belief system. And so, but what happened, and this is what I find so fascinating about this woman, she had a baby, and she was sitting there in the hospital holding this baby, and she realized the ramifications of her belief system, believing that it was more morally acceptable to kill the child that was in her arms than it would be to kill an adult pig who might end up on your breakfast table. And she knew inherently, innately, that can't be true. That cannot be true. And then she further continued to ask herself, because according to her materialistic perspective, what she believed was just this random chemical reaction in her brain, her thoughts, her love, her overwhelming desire to nourish and cherish this child. That was just random chemical reactions according to her assumptions. Yeah. And she knew innately that can't be true. There's something else here. She sensed that there was a spiritual truth that was causing and compelling her to have this overwhelming love for this other human being. That's what I love about parenthood, because it really is such a sanctifying work. It is such a work that really points us towards our Heavenly Father and how He loves us. And that is how she has come to faith in God, was through having a child and really challenging her former assumptions. And that's how she arrived at those conclusions, that God must be real because there is a spirit world. And this human being I'm holding in my hand is more important than the bacon on my breakfast table. Yep. This child matters more than adult pigs. Okay.
Yep. She experienced a disconnect with reality.
And she experienced everything through the nature of what a human being is. It really challenged her. And parenting does that to us in ways that very few other experiences in life can do that the way that parenting can. And so I think we've all come to those kind of conclusions. And hopefully all of our children will come to those conclusions as well as they make us into grandparents. But let's finish up the last few questions you have here, because I think these questions are so helpful for our kids going into these secular institutions as they get off into college, like this young woman did. And she at least was honest, and she was a truth seeker, and she challenged her assumptions. So how do these other three, how many questions do we have left? Three more.
Yeah. Okay. The sixth question of the critical assumptions test is, how do we acquire knowledge? Once we understand our assumptions related to what humans are, the thing that we do all of our lives from the moment we're born is acquire knowledge. We lack it. And so we're in a constant lifelong pursuit of acquiring knowledge. Well, how do we go about doing that? Well, if you're operating from type 1 assumptions that it's just physical only stuff, where does knowledge come from? Well, it just comes from biochemical reactions in our brains. Our five senses, they detect something, creates a chemical reaction in our brain that sparks off a thought. So isn't that interesting? Did you have any control over that?
Nope.
No. Nobody has any control over the biochemistry in their brains. Therefore, they have no control over their thoughts. How are they even their thoughts? It's irrational. How do you acquire knowledge that way, much less pass it on to other people, which is the business of education, by the way, acquiring knowledge and passing it on to people. How do you do that with those type 1 assumptions? You can't.
Yeah, that's what C.S. Lewis talked about. He talked about that. I quoted this recently on the show. Supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It is merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen happen for physical or chemical reasons to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives me, as a byproduct, the sensation I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. I love Lewis. He's amazing. He goes on to say, but if I can't trust my own thinking, of course, I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else unless this is the clincher. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought. So I can never use thought to disbelieve God. Yep. End of quote, mic drop. I think he really encapsulated what we're talking about here. We can't trust our own thinking. And that's what Jennifer Fulwiler came to the conclusion. I can't even trust my own thoughts and my own feelings because they're chemical reactions. I can't even trust them if there is not some author of them, if there is not some spiritual realm that is even as real, if not more real than the physical material realm that I live in. So questioning those.
And how are they even my thoughts?
Yeah.
There's no me to do the thinking. There's no me to do the feeling. It's just the chemistry doing whatever it does.
Right. I know. I was thinking about this, like the animal kingdom, they don't really sit around and contemplate all of this. Like the cheetahs, why is it? Is it really fair in the animal kingdom that I'm the fastest? Is it really fair that I'm able to go out there and hunt down the antelope and the zebras? And, that's not equity. That's not equality in the animal kingdom. Maybe I should, repress they're not contemplating this when they're going after their next meal, are they? No. Somehow we've evolved into this higher form of being that actually has these ethical concerns about and trying to create some idealistic world. Why would we even have a notion that we had fallen short of that if there wasn't some sort of a perfection or ideal that we fell from that we're trying to get back to? We just can't do it in our own strength. We're not capable of accomplishing that. So
the type 2 person, the way that they answer that question, knowledge comes from my own mind or spirit, because that's all there is minds and spirits. So knowledge comes from my own mind or spirit. But the problem is I lack knowledge. But I'm told, look inside myself. That's where the answers lie. Trust your heart. Trust your feelings. Luke, trust your feelings.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I lack knowledge. So I'm supposed to look inside myself where there isn't knowledge in the first place to find it? How am I supposed to find it if I don't have it already? That doesn't work very well, does it?
No,
one day I might become enlightened, but acquiring it from my own mind or spirit doesn't work very well. That's not a reliable way to acquire knowledge either. I lack it. How do I get it from my own mind? I can't because it's not there. But the type 3 answer is that how do we acquire knowledge? We acquire it from God. Because first of all, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So all knowledge begins with God because he has all the content of knowledge. He knows everything about everything because he made everything. So he knows everything about everything, to be overly redundant. But interestingly, too, is the way that we acquire it is the apparatus that we use to acquire it also comes from God. How do we acquire knowledge from God? He has it. We don't. How do we get it from him? Well, certainly from our spiritual communion with God, we gain knowledge that way, but more conventionally with our rational processes and our 5 senses. But we didn't go out to the eye store and buy a pair. We didn't go out to the brain store to get one. So where do we get those things? We got them from him. So all the knowledge comes from God, and the means by which we acquire it come from God. And that makes far more sense than the other 2 answers. That's why the type 3 answer is true. It corresponds to the actual world that we see, know, and experience, the one that we know. That's why that assumption is true. The 7th question is, what is good? I'm not asking about people's ethical systems. I'm just simply asking, when you use the word good, what do you mean by that? So the type 1 answer, good is whatever I decide it is. I mean, who else is there to do the deciding but us?
Yeah.
There's no God. So it's just us. So whatever I decide or whatever we as a group, that people that agree with me, whatever we decide is good is good.
Yeah. And how's that worked in history?
Yeah, that doesn't work really well.
No.
Because then there is nothing that's universally good. So what's good for you may not be good for me. So that's a more relativistic way of doing things. The type 2 answer is whatever makes me or the world better, whatever achieves the ideal. So that changes with the wind. It's completely situational. It's utilitarian. Whatever achieves the ideal is good. So if it means that I lie today, that could be good if it helps me to achieve the ideal, or it could be bad if it doesn't. If defending a sex offender will achieve the ideal, I'll do that. But if condemning a sex offender will achieve the ideal, I'll do that. It doesn't mean that the sex offense itself is evil. It just means in this situation at this time, will it get us further down the road? And we see that constantly in our society today.
Oh, my goodness, yes.
That means there is nothing that's evil. There's nothing that's good for everybody. So, when people complain about us Christians, oh, you evil, rotten, nasty thing, you don't know what good is. So no, all it is that you're complaining that I didn't adopt your morality. Because you say that every person decides for themselves what's good and what's right. That's fine. But if that's really true, why are you all upset? Because I didn't adopt yours? I thought I had the freedom to choose my own.
That trips up.
But you don't want me to choose my own. You want me to choose yours.
Exactly.
So that makes you a self-righteous hypocrite, or it makes you a tyrant because you're trying to push your morality on me. But if you want to condemn something as evil, the only way you can do that is if there's a standard of good beyond humanity. God himself. That's the type 3 answer. God alone is good. No human is good, as in we are a source of goodness. God alone is the source of goodness. That's the scripture is very clear about that. Paul said in Romans 7, no good dwells in me. Well, he's about the most righteous guy to ever live. He said, no good dwells in me. The very thing I want to do, I don't do. And the very thing I don't want to do is the thing I do. Who's going to deliver me from this body of death? In Psalm 119:68, the Lord is good and does good. Who he is and what he does is the definition and description of good. When Jesus talked to the rich young ruler, he said, good teacher, what must I do to be saved? He said, why are you asking me about what's good? Only God alone is good. Unless you want to say I'm God, which was the point of the conversation.
Yes. He was pointing him towards God on that one. That God is how we define goodness.
Yeah. So God in his character is the definition of goodness.
See, back to what you were saying about the type 2 response on this one. That's how we end up, because I think a lot of us have been scratching our head. How do we end up with a political movement that is saying defund the police? Because that seems so just asinine. It seems so destructive to society. But with the idealist, they know that they have to, if they can create that kind of chaos and within the Western system that we have, within the foundational pillars that we have in terms of law enforcement, if they can create that kind of chaos, then that moves them towards their ideal.
Of course it does.
And that's why, because I think for so many of us, we're like, why in the world would you suggest something like that? But when you understand the neo-Marxist agenda, that they have to get rid of these 5 pillars of Western institutions: family, media, law, education, and religion. And religion. The 5th one was Antonio Gramsci came up with those 5 pillars of Western civilization. And so understanding that law and law enforcement, they had their ideal, they have to get rid of that foundational Western pillar. And in order to do that, defunding the police is the way to get there. Now, look at all the casualties. Look at how high crime has gone in all of those cities. Murder rates has risen. And then you've got all of these Soros DAs and all of these places that are letting people out that are having this recidivism and committing the same crimes in all of these cities. How can that be good for society? Because they're idealists, right? How can that be good? Because it gets them closer to their utopian Marxist ideal, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And
that's how they get there.
It starts with this basic assumption about what good is.
Yes.
Whatever achieves the ideal. And essentially what they're operating from is the notion that humans are basically good. If humans are basically good, in other words, we're a source of goodness, where does the evil in society come from? Well, it can't come from me because I'm basically good. So the evil must come from something outside of me. So when you think of things outside of us that could potentially be acting on us to make us do bad stuff when we would normally do the good thing, what are those? Well, it could be an object. So we want to ban or control objects like alcohol, cigarettes, cell phones, guns, knives, weapons. It could be SUVs, because the use of those evil things acting on humans, making them do bad stuff when they would normally do the good things. So you want to ban or control that object so that they don't exert that influence on people, so that they will naturally do the good. Or the evil may be in a structure or in the system, systemic inequality, systemic racism, systemic sexism, whatever the systemic is, it's something in the system that's evil. And so you want to fix the system. And when you fix the system, then it will no longer be exerting that evil influence on humans, and humans will naturally do the good because people are basically good. That's the assumption. Or if it's not in an object or in a system, then it must be in society itself. So you want to tear society down and rebuild it so that it will no longer exert an evil influence and people will naturally do the good. So that's why they're tearing society down, because the evil is in the system. It's evil in the society because people are naturally good. So you get rid of those evil influences, then we can achieve utopia. We can achieve the ideal. People will naturally do the good without those evil influences. But none of that is reality.
Yeah. A certain former president referred to that as fundamentally transforming society. Didn't he? Yes. Fundamentally transforming society. That's exactly where he was going. So we have one question left, don't we?
Yep. And the last one is, what's the problem with the world? What's humanity's basic problem? So we've answered question number 7. What is good? Then if we understand what good is, then what's the problem with the world? Well, if you're a type 1 assumer and everything's just physical, what's the problem with the world? Well, it's religious people, of course.
Yeah.
Because they believe in things like gods and angels and demons and all kinds of other fairy tales and leprechauns and Easter bunnies and tooth fairies. Because none of those things are real. None of those things certainly are important. And it's those beliefs in those things and trying to advance those kinds of things that keeps human beings from being able to evolve into what we're intended to be. So the evil in the world comes from religion and religious people. And that's considered mental illness. It's considered oppression, many different things like that by type 1 assumers. But if you're a type 2 assumer, so ignorance of the ideal is the problem with the type 2 assumer. Right. People don't understand what the ideal is and how we can achieve it. Right. And so that requires education and enlightenment, those kinds of things. And as people understand what the ideal is, then they'll want to achieve it. They'll voluntarily get involved. And if not, we'll make the rest of them go along. And the ones that don't, we have to get rid of them because it's ignorance of the ideal that can be achieved that is the problem with the world. And so that's the inequality that we see in society, that people are wrapped up in these physical things that they think are important when in fact it's that world that we can build together that's really important. And so we want to achieve equality. And that's the emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that when everybody has the same amount of stuff, same amount of power, same amount of whatever, then we won't be focused on those things and we can achieve the ideal. Right. So that's what the problem with the world is ignorance of the ideal and that we can achieve it. But if the type 3 answer is correct, then the problem with the world is God is good and we're not. It's not that we're bad all the time. It's just that we don't do good all the time. And there's nothing we can do about it. And it's our collective doing of the bad that causes all the craziness in the world. And so if that's the diagnosis of the problem with the world, you'll offer a different solution. You'll offer the materialist gospel. You'll offer the idealist gospel, the gospel of equality, or the gospel of Jesus Christ is the solution. Because if humans could fix themselves, they wouldn't need a savior. But in fact, we can't because we didn't make ourselves. See, if I make a car, I can fix a car. If I make a computer, I can fix a computer. If whatever humans can make, we can fix them. But we didn't make ourselves.
No, we did not.
And so what's broken with us, we cannot fix. That's why we needed a savior. We need the one who made us to fix us.
Yeah. I think you put it in your book at one point. It's one thing to try to fix the human condition. It's quite another thing to
fix humans.
To fix humans. That's above our pay grade. We are called by God, and he does this throughout scripture with the Old Testament prophets to help fix the human condition. And it said in scripture, that true religion is taking care of widows and orphans. We are called by God to fix the human condition, but we can't fix humans. That's above our pay grade. That is in God's realm and God's realm alone. And so we have to surrender to him. And there's only one way that we can be fixed. And that's through the work that he did on the cross for us, and understanding how to get to those answers and show how these other answers are going to get people hanged up. They're going to get to the end of their core assumptions. And I think you put it, when you get to the end of your core assumptions, when that gets challenged, that's the point of conversion, I think is how you put it, right?
Yes. Because when you exchange one core assumption for another core assumption, that is a complete conversion. That's what happens.
That's what we're after. That is truly what we're after. Goodness.
And it's interesting that if you read down the columns of the critical assumption test on page 36 of my book, you see, the core assumption and then all the answers derived from that core assumption, the secondary assumptions from the other 7 questions. You read down the column, that's a statement of faith. So, back to the Peter Boghossian thing, where he says that faith is a cognitive sickness has been turned into a moral virtue. Really? Well, you're operating from a type 1 statement of faith. Right. You're a person of faith just like me. And here is your dogma. Right. And you can, even a middle schooler can understand that. It's easy. You think that it's just a physical only existence that was made by natural laws, run by natural laws. It's heading towards annihilation and death. A human is nothing more than a highly evolved animal who acquires knowledge through biochemical processes, through that good is whatever we decide it is, and the problem with the world is religious people. That's your basic dogma. All of that's assumed. You can't prove any of it. You question it. You don't question it, and you can't prove it. Right. But you assume it, and that is a person of faith just as much as you and I. They just start with a different core assumption about the nature of reality, and therefore have a different faith. But we're all people of faith because we don't know everything. We assume certain things and we can't help it, which ultimately means that every government agency and program promotes religion. Yes. Can't help it. Every business is based on a theology. Every teacher in every school and every class every day teaches theology. They just don't teach Christian theology because you cannot divorce yourself from your basic assumptions about what's real. And so whether you try to do it or not, you can't avoid it. You will. If you won't teach the type 3 set of assumptions, you'll teach type 1 or type 2. You can't avoid it. You will do one of them. And so why don't you be upfront and honest about which one you are going to promote? Because you will promote one. Mm-hmm. Even if you try not to, you can't do it.
That's true, because we're all operating from our core assumptions every day.
Yes. And those are the things that control us.
They are.
How to see through the powerful assumptions that control you. This is the subtitle of the book.
Yeah. And that's what you do. And that's what you describe beautifully. I'm really camping out in this. I'm really enjoying going through these. And your critical assumption tests, I think, was really helpful. Sure. The chart that you have. So moms and dads, if you want a more effective way, a simpler way of identifying and understanding where a person is coming from in their beliefs, if you want to get to their core beliefs quickly and have a better strategy on how to reach them with the truth, pick up a copy of this book, Transparent: How to See Through the Powerful Assumptions That Control You. It's really helping me, Dave. I've really enjoyed this and this time with you. Tell one more time where our listeners can learn more about you and your ministry and get a copy of this amazing book.
Sure. Well, our ministry is Assumptions Institute, and assumptionsinstitute.org is about the ministry. Then all of our discernment resources, our discernment training, you can find the book at, of course, all the major booksellers, but the transparentbook.com. That's the word transparentbook.com is where you can find the book. And then all of our training courses, we have an essentials course for teaching the basics of our discernment system for individuals and for church small groups. Those are available, as well as semester-long courses for Christian schools, homeschools, and homeschool co-ops to help people become truth ninjas and to be able to be effective truth warriors in our society. And all of those can be found at learntodiscern.com/Christian parent.
Awesome.
Learntodiscern.com/Christian parent. That's where you can find all of our training resources.
Thank you so much for creating that page for us. I appreciate that. Dave, this has just been fascinating, utterly fascinating, so helpful and practical. Understanding your critical assumptions test is, like I said, it's been helping me tremendously when I try to assess from where another person is coming from. So it's helping really all of my personal relationships, even my relationship with my own kids. So thank you so much for generously sharing your time with us today, Dave. I really appreciate it. It's been an honor to have you on the show.
It's my pleasure, Catherine. Thanks for having me on.
I want to thank you for joining me today. Look, I know there are a lot of things you could be listening to right now, and I really appreciate that you took this time to spend with me. I hope you will join me for my next podcast when we take aim at some aspect of our culture that threatens to derail our parenting and steal our kids' faith. If you enjoyed this episode of Christian Parent Crazy World, would you consider telling a friend and sharing it on social media and giving it a good review over on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and following me on Facebook and Instagram? Oh, and maybe you could say that Christian Parent Crazy World is the best podcast you've ever heard in your entire life. Just a thought. And be sure to check out my website, which is CatherineSeegers.com. That's Catherine with a C. I have lots of articles and resources there that will help you on your parenting journey. And if you subscribe, I will be sure to send you some really cool free stuff and notify you of future podcasts, articles, and blogs. I want to end this and every episode with a word of encouragement. God gave you your kids, your specific kids, for a reason. That's because you hold the key to unlocking who God created them to be. We'll see you next time.
Christian Parent Crazy World is a production of Life Audio and Salem Media. If you liked what you heard today, please take a second to rate and review this podcast in your favorite podcast app so that more listeners like you can find the show. For more faith-filled, inspirational podcasts, visit us at lifeaudio.com.